Before I go on, I just want to really acknowledge all the folks who have been involved, who have been an integral part of the study, including the 1,600, over 1,600 participants, their mothers and their infant children who have tirelessly allowed us to measure them every 3 months. So I want a big thank you to all of them and our partners on the ground here, HKI Nepal, as well as Patan Academy of Health Sciences. This endeavor would not be possible with all these individuals who have been involved on the ground. We've had over 60 people supporting and conducting and implementing this study on the ground. I want to sort of give you a background around the topic that we're talking about, which is around looking at aflatoxin exposure in pregnancy and early life. There have been several observational studies, most of them in sub-Saharan Africa, that have documented an association between aflatoxin and linear growth. But there have been very few studies in Asia because the general impression is the source of aflatoxin is usually maize and groundnuts, which is more commonly consumed in higher amounts in sub-Saharan Africa. That being said, there is consumption of maize and groundnuts in South Asia, and so this was one of that was the impetus for thinking about looking at aflatoxins in Nepal for the Nutrition Innovation Lab. So as we started working on this study, there was some publications that came out from the MAL-ED or MALED, however you want to call it, where they found no association between length for age Z-score, which is a metric of child growth, linear growth, and aflatoxins at 36 months. So that's one of the first studies in Nepal. The other study that had seen high levels of aflatoxin came from our colleagues at Johns Hopkins from the data from Sarlahi. There's also been some mixed evidence in sub-Saharan Africa with a study from IFPRI that has shown that the intervention to mitigate aflatoxin does not translate into improved growth. So essentially, what we're seeing is a field that is seeing some evidence of association, some evidence of relationships, but there's also information out there and data out there that is not allowing us to have a conclusive confirmation on this relationship. So let me just give you a little bit of a brief outline on what the AFLA cohort study is. It's an observational birth cohort study which has been shut down. I always use the present tense, but I should use the past tense now. It was conducted in 17 VDCs or municipalities, as they're called, in the Banke district of Nepal. And we had recruited 1,675 women in pregnancy, and we followed them and their infants through almost 26 months of life. That was the last measurement that we did. And we really wanted to understand longitudinally what is the exposure to aflatoxin. Is the exposure in pregnancy related to birth outcomes? And is the exposure over early life then related to linear growth? So that's the overall objective. And in today's presentation, I'm really focusing primarily on what happened in early life in the infants after 3 months of age. We've already published and presented last year on the exposure in pregnancy and its relationship with birth outcomes. For those of you who may not be familiar, the aflatoxin biomarker is called the Serum AFB1 lysine adduct concentration, and it's basically measuring aflatoxin B1, which is the most common form of aflatoxin that you find as a contaminant. And what we did was we analyzed samples in the entire study on pregnant women and then their infants at 3, 6, 12, and 18 to 22 months. And the method that is used uses the HPLC method, and our colleagues at the University of Georgia are the experts in conducting this analysis. This is just to give you a timeline of the study. The study was conducted in 2 phases, and you can see that we started in July of 2015, and we wrapped up the study in March of 2019, and it's a rolling study because it took us 6 months to recruit 1,600 women in 17 VDCs. So we call it a rolling cohort, which is why it took us about 4.5 years to complete all the time points across all the population. In terms of the specific methods for the analysis that I'm going to present, first of all, are the AFB1 lysine data that are being used to assess the relationship with linear growth are not normally distributed, so we have to log transform this for all the statistical analysis. The second key critical and the variable that we are looking at is anthropometric measurements, and in the case of this presentation, we are specifically focused on length for age z-score, and we are using weight for length z-score as well, and these were computed using the WHO growth standards. The last thing I want to say from the analytical point of view is that about 90%, about 10 to 15% of the samples in the infants were undetectable. And there is always a concern when you throw out all your undetectable data if that there was something different about them, which is why we had to understand a way or find a way of incorporating that data into our analysis. And so we assigned, based upon our laboratory colleagues, an undetectable value of 0.2 picograms per milligram of the lysine adduct, but then we also created a dummy variable so that we were not creating any bias using a predetermined undetectable value. Just to give you an idea of the statistical analysis or the models we used a multivariable fixed effects regression model, and what we were testing was the association between length in centimeters or LAZ, or length for age z-score, and serum aflatoxin levels. We use a contemporaneous model, which is where we have pooled all the data for across all the time points, but we are using a fixed effects model, and we are looking at the relative effect of time point. The reason we chose this was because serum aflatoxin and length for age z-score specifically reflect past exposure. For instance, serum aflatoxin has a half-life of 90 days. So before I go into the results of our model, let me just present to you what the descriptives look like. Here is the data on the serum aflatoxin B1, and you can see we are presenting the pregnancy data just to give you an idea the level of exposure, and we are presenting the level, the detectable levels. You see that 94% of the women had detectable levels of aflatoxin. When you look at the children from 3 months to 22 months, the range is between 75 to 80%. So essentially you could say over 3/4 of the children starting from 3 months of age do have detectable levels of aflatoxin. The third column you're looking at is the mean value. Now we want to take this in a little bit of a caveat, in the sense that this is not a log transform value, but what you see is that the levels are much lower than what you find in the women, but they are steadily increasing over time. So the message here is levels are low in the women to begin with. We've presented that before, but that in the kids, what we are seeing is that as they are being exposed to contaminated foods, including which could be basically carbohydrate-based, such as maize, we are seeing levels increase. In terms of the length for age z-score over time, this is not an unusual presentation I'm making here. Many of you are very familiar that from early life to 2 years of age, you find that the children do have a reduction in length for age z-score, and you have an increased prevalence of stunting by the time infants are 2 years of age. So we are seeing that same pattern that many of you are probably seeing in your own data for Nepali children. This is just to give you we are presenting the coefficients for 2 models, one in which we actually 4 models, if you will. The first model is looking at length in centimeters. First 2 models are looking at length in centimeters, and the other two models are looking at LAZ, and the first row is where we are looking at log transform aflatoxin B1 and length. And what you find is there is a significant negative association between length in centimeters and aflatoxin, and it's about minus 0.19. So for every unit increase of log aflatoxin, you get a 0.19 centimeter decrease in length in kids. And the second row is essentially presenting the aflatoxin data per kg body weight. One of the interesting things that we found was that there was a very strong positive association between aflatoxin levels in the infants and body weight. And incidentally, we are seeing this across the board, not only in the infants in Nepal, we are seeing it in the mums in Nepal, we are seeing it in the mums in Uganda in a similar study, we are seeing it in the infants in Uganda, and we are seeing it in children under 5 years of age in Mozambique that aflatoxin levels very strongly correlate with weight. So the higher the weight of the infant or the mother or the young child, they are likely to have higher levels of aflatoxin. So we wanted to test if there is an effect of weight, and that's what the second set of models is. And what we find is, in fact, the relationship becomes stronger when you adjust for weight. So in conclusion, we find a significant negative association in length and length for HZ score when assessing exposure in young infants from 3 months through 22 months of age. This is looking at both absolute serum levels as well as serum levels per kg body weight in log transformed, using log transformation. I just want to sort of highlight that the study has wrapped up, but there's a lot of analysis going on. And one of the things that we've been fortunate to be able to do is look at other mycotoxins such as fumonisins in urine and DON and OTA in serum in the last time point. We don't have it across the entire longitudinal study, but we have it at the last time point, and that's going to allow us to look at cross-sectional associations between co-exposures, because one of the key questions emerging around aflatoxin is the relationship because of the high level of fumonisins or other mycotoxins that might coexist at the same time with aflatoxin. The other thing is there's a big discussion around what is the mechanism by which aflatoxin could possibly be being correlated to linear growth, and there has been some postulations made around inflammation and environmental enteric using the similar pathways from environmental enteric dysfunction. So we are going to be able to analyze inflammatory markers in our bank samples that will allow us to understand if aflatoxin exposure was correlated with inflammation and environmental enteric dysfunction. We've also had the opportunity to do some assessment of cognitive function as the children have turned 22 to 24 months of age, and so we'll be able to look at early life and maternal exposures in aflatoxin and subsequent cognitive function. So that's another set of analysis. And lastly, because of the longitudinal nature of the study, we were able to explore other anthropometric markers, including head circumference and knee heel length, which is a measure of long bone growth, which is considered to be potentially one of the reasons why there is this increased level of stunting. So we'll be able to look at some new analyses and possibly propose potential hypotheses for future research. So thank you very much for listening to me.